The hum of the ultrasound machine filled the quiet exam room at Portland Women's Health Center. Julia Dawson lay back on the padded table, her hands clutching the thin blanket that covered her midsection. At 29, this was her first pregnancy, and she had come in expecting nothing more than a routine checkup. The sterile smell of disinfectant, the soft shuffle of papers, the distant voices from the hallway, all of it blurred together as Dr. Evelyn Grant, her OB-GYN, adjusted the wand across Julia's stomach. Julia's husband, Mark, sat close beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. His face lit up with anticipation, the kind that made him look younger than his 32 years. Mark had been waiting for this moment with quiet patience, sketching out dreams in his mind as carefully as the houses he designed as an architect. Then Dr. Grant broke the silence. "Well," she said with a professional smile, "I can confirm everything looks healthy. And Julia, congratulations. You're expecting twins." The words seemed to hang in the air. Twins. For a moment, Julia's mind went blank. She blinked rapidly at the doctor, then at the glowing screen, where two small flickers pulsed in tandem. Her throat tightened. Instead of joy, panic surged through her body like a sudden fever. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, that can't be right. Please, not this." Her voice cracked, and tears spilled from her eyes before she could stop them. Mark leaned closer, squeezing her hand. Hey, it's okay," he murmured, his voice soft and steady, but Julia pulled her hand free. She covered her face, sobs breaking out of her like a dam had burst. Dr. Grant looked startled. "Julia, I assure you both babies are developing well. This is wonderful news." But Julia couldn't hear the reassurance. The word twins kept echoing in her mind, dragging her back to nights long ago when she had been 10 years old, tucking crying siblings into bed while her parents argued in the next room. She saw herself carrying laundry that wasn't hers, cooking meals with hands too small to reach the stove comfortably, running between diapers and homework while her mother sat idly and her father disappeared with another bottle. She had been the second mother in a household that had 8 children and too little hope to share among them. She had promised herself, fiercely and without compromise, that her own adulthood would be different. One child, that was all. One life to nurture fully, without drowning in exhaustion, without the crushing weight of endless responsibility. And now this. Julia's sobs grew louder, raw and inconsolable. Mark brushed her shoulder with tentative fingers. He tried to smile at Dr. Grant, tried to smooth over the outburst with a murmured, "She's just overwhelmed. We didn't expect this." But inside he was reeling too, not from fear, but from wonder. He had dreamed of a family bigger than just one child, though he had kept those hopes quiet after hearing Julia's firm declaration years ago. To him, twins felt like a gift, an unexpected blessing. Still, watching his wife crumple beneath the weight of her own memories, he swallowed the joy that threatened to escape. She came first, always. "Julia, sweetheart," he said gently, "we'll be okay. You're not a little girl anymore. You're not alone. It's me and you this time." She shook her head against the tears. "You don't understand. I can't, 2 babies, I can't do it." Mark kissed her forehead. "You won't be doing it alone. We'll figure it out together." The appointment wrapped up awkwardly, Julia clinging to tissues, her cheeks blotched red, while Dr. Grant printed ultrasound images with the kind of cheerful tone that felt almost cruel to Julia's ears. Mark tucked the photos into his jacket pocket before she could push them away. The drive home was quiet. Rain traced the car windows, blurring the gray streets of Portland. Julia leaned against the seat, silent, her thoughts locked inside. Mark kept one hand on the wheel and one on her knee, offering steady warmth. He didn't press her to talk. He knew enough about Julia's past to understand why the news had struck her like a blow, though perhaps not the full depth of her scars. It hadn't always been this way between them. Their story had begun years earlier, in the most ordinary yet fateful of places, a marketing office in downtown Portland. Julia had been a junior coordinator, drafting advertising copy late into the night. Mark, already working as a rising architect, had been brought in on a joint project to design promotional material for a housing development. They met over stacks of plans and brochures, both frustrated and tired, and somehow laughter had slipped in where annoyance had been. That laughter grew into coffee breaks, then late dinners, then long walks along the eastern promenade overlooking Casco Bay. Julia had been guarded, hesitant to trust, but Mark's patience wore down the walls brick by brick. 2 years later, they married in a modest ceremony by the ocean, surrounded by a handful of family and friends. With their savings, they bought a small plot of land on the outskirts of Portland. Mark poured himself into designing a home just for them, sketching every corner with Julia in mind. He built wide windows to let in the coastal light, a backyard large enough for future children, and a cozy kitchen where he pictured Julia baking. For him, the house was more than wood and nails. It was a promise of stability, the foundation for the family he hoped they would create. Now, as they pulled into the gravel driveway, Julia sat frozen, staring at the house that was supposed to be her safe place. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and the sea breeze that slipped through the cracks. Mark helped her out of the car, holding her hand even when she tried to pull away. In the living room, Julia sank into the couch, burying her face in her hands again. Mark crouched before her. "Listen," he said softly, "I know this is scary, but this house, this life, we built it for us, for our family. It doesn't matter if it's 1 child or 2. We'll make it work." Her sobs quieted into shaky breaths. She looked at him, eyes rimmed red. "You really think I can do this?" "I don't just think it," he answered. "I know it, because I'll be with you every step of the way." For the first time since the clinic, Julia let herself lean against him. The fear hadn't gone, not entirely, but in the steady circle of his arms, there was a sliver of comfort, a fragile beginning to hope. Julia sat in the quiet of her living room that evening, the faint creak of the old house mingling with the whisper of rain outside. Mark had gone upstairs to sketch in his office, leaving her alone on the couch. The ultrasound images lay on the coffee table, 2 tiny silhouettes she couldn't bear to look at. As her fingers brushed against the glossy paper, her mind slipped back decades, carrying her not to Portland, but to the heart of Pennsylvania, where her story had begun. Her childhood had never been the kind of memory people spoke of fondly. She had grown up in a cramped house that smelled of damp wood and cigarette smoke, with peeling paint on the porch and a roof that leaked each spring. Her father, once a promising factory worker, had surrendered to alcohol long before Julia was old enough to understand what addiction meant. By the time she reached school age, his presence was more often in a bottle than at the dinner table. Her mother didn't work. She drifted through the days in a haze of bitterness and resignation, nursing her own disappointments but never lifting a finger to ease the family's burden. That left Julia, the eldest of 8 children, to become the one who held everything together. At 10 years old, while other girls were learning to braid hair or ride their bikes across the cul-de-sac, Julia was learning how to keep a household from collapsing. She cooked basic meals with trembling hands, stirring pasta in a dented pot while her baby brother wailed in the background. She scrubbed laundry in a rusted sink, pinning damp clothes on a line strung across the yard. She braided her younger sister's hair in the mornings before school, packed their lunches when there was enough bread to go around, and tucked them into bed at night with stories she barely had the energy to tell. There were no Saturday sleepovers, no carefree afternoons at the mall. Childhood, for Julia, had been a ledger of responsibilities, tasks to complete, mouths to feed, tears to wipe away. And for all the effort, there was never enough. Not enough food, not enough money, not enough tenderness. Just survival. Even when moments of happiness slipped through, new clothes from a church charity, a birthday cake cobbled together from box mix, the thrill of a snow day, they were fleeting, always overshadowed by the relentless demands of a house with too many children and too little love. It was there, in that chaos, that Julia had made herself a vow. One child. That was all she would ever bring into this world. One life she could devote herself to fully without being stretched thin, without repeating the mistakes of her parents. She promised herself that no child of hers would ever feel invisible, would ever be asked to carry burdens meant for adults. She carried that promise like a shield into adulthood. It was part of what made her cautious in relationships, wary of anyone who spoke too eagerly of building a big family. When she met Mark, she had confessed it early on, almost defiantly, one child, that's my limit. He had nodded, and though she had caught a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, he never argued. Now, years later, sitting in the comfort of the house they had built together, she thought of that shield and how flimsy it suddenly seemed. Her life with Mark was nothing like the house she'd grown up in. This home was filled with light, large windows that framed the sea in the distance, the smell of cedar and fresh paint still lingering in the beams Mark had measured and nailed with his own hands. Their kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances, the counters clear except for the vase of fresh flowers Mark often brought home from the farmer's market. Most evenings were quiet, warm, ordinary in the best of ways. They cooked dinner side by side, sometimes pasta tossed with herbs from the small garden Julia had insisted on planting. They took walks along the shoreline, their laughter carried by the salty wind. On weekends, Mark tinkered with home projects while Julia browsed books or planned recipes she wanted to try. There were no shouting matches, no slammed doors, no younger siblings crying out for attention she couldn't give. It was, in every sense, the life she had dreamed of, the proof that she had broken free from the cycle of scarcity and chaos. This life was her happily ever after, carefully built piece by piece, fragile and precious. And yet, with the doctor's words still ringing in her ears, Julia felt that fragile life tilting. 2 children. The number alone threatened to unravel everything she had worked to protect. She imagined sleepless nights stretched endlessly. Double the crying, double the costs, double the fear that she would fail. The memory of her childhood clung to her like a shadow. She could still hear her father's slurred voice from the porch, still smell the sour beer on his breath. She could still feel the ache in her small arms from carrying a baby on one hip while balancing a pot of boiling water with the other. She had escaped that world. But had she escaped it enough to keep it from repeating? Upstairs, she heard the faint scratch of Mark's pencil as he sketched. He was planning the next addition to their home, a sunroom he thought would catch the best light in the mornings. Always building, always hopeful. That was who he was. Julia, meanwhile, felt like she was crumbling inside. She loved Mark deeply, and she wanted to give him the family he dreamed of, but 2 children at once felt like stepping back into the nightmare she had sworn she'd never relive. She pressed a hand to her stomach, trembling. 1 child, she reminded herself. That had been the promise. But fate, it seemed, had decided otherwise. 9 months later, the house Mark had designed echoed with the sound of new life. At Maine Medical Center in Portland, Julia Dawson gave birth to 2 healthy baby boys, a pair of cries piercing the delivery room and filling it with both chaos and wonder. She was exhausted, sweat dampening her hairline, her hands trembling from hours of labor. But when the nurses placed the infants in her arms, the weight of them felt surreal. 2 tiny bodies, red-faced and wriggling, each with a heartbeat steady against her chest. "Aiden and Cole," Mark whispered, his voice thick as he kissed her temple. He had insisted they name one after his grandfather, and Julia, though still dazed, had agreed. The other name she had chosen for herself. Together, they spoke them aloud like a prayer. Aiden Dawson and Cole Dawson, their sons. Mark's joy was unrestrained. He moved around the room in a blur, thanking nurses, holding one son while Julia held the other, taking picture after picture on his phone as if he could capture every second before it slipped away. His laughter was soft, reverent, a sound Julia had rarely heard from him, and it made the corners of her mouth lift despite her exhaustion. For Julia, the joy was quieter, more hesitant. At first, she felt only the shock of doubling. 2 mouths to feed, 2 bodies to cradle, twice the work she had braced herself for. But as the days bled into nights and she learned the rhythms of her newborns, something shifted. She discovered that holding one son while hearing the soft coo of the other didn't feel like drowning the way she had feared. Instead, it was a strange, expansive fullness she hadn't expected. Love didn't divide between 2 children, it multiplied. The weeks after bringing the boys home were a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and stolen naps. The Dawson house, once quiet, now pulsed with life. Julia learned to distinguish their cries. Aiden's sharper, Cole's more guttural. She found herself smiling at the way they flailed their arms, as though they were already arguing in some secret language only they understood. Mark, true to his word, shared every task. He paced the halls with a baby cradled against his chest at 3 a.m, built a rocking cradle in the garage during the day, and whispered stories to them in the evenings about the houses he would one day design for them to see. Slowly, Julia's fear began to fade. She would sit in the nursery, rocking one son while the other slept nearby, and feel something she hadn't in years: peace. Her vow of only one child seemed less like a rule carved in stone and more like a shield she no longer needed. Outside their home, the Portland suburb where they lived revealed itself as a mosaic of lives. Their street wound gently through a neighborhood of tidy houses, some freshly painted, others weathered by salt air from the nearby coast. Families varied: older couples tending rose bushes, young professionals rushing off to work, parents pushing strollers in the evenings. The Dawsons fit comfortably in, their modest home blending with the rhythm of suburban life. But not all houses on the street told stories of stability. Across the way lived a young couple with a boy about 3 years old. Julia had noticed them before the twins were born, but in the haze of new motherhood, their presence became sharper in her mind. The parents often came home with grocery bags clinking faintly with bottles, their laughter too loud, too careless. Their son, Liam, trailed behind them in worn sneakers, his small frame lost in oversized clothes that never seemed warm enough for Maine's long winters. Julia's heart clenched every time she saw him. His hair was uncombed, his cheeks pale, his little hands bare even on days when frost still lingered on the grass. She caught glimpses of him standing by the chain-link fence in their yard, staring at her twins when she carried them outside for fresh air. His eyes were large and solemn, too old for a child his age. Mark noticed her lingering looks. "He's their child," he said gently one evening as they watched Liam toddle along behind his parents, who carried 6-packs of beer instead of toys or books. "It's not our place." Julia nodded, but the image of the boy stayed with her long after the Dawsons' front door had closed. She couldn't shake the ache in her chest. She had 2 babies now, 2 sons she could love and protect with all the strength she possessed. And yet, when she looked across the street and saw Liam's thin shoulders hunched against the wind, she felt a sharp tug in her heart, as if fate were whispering that her story with him was not yet written. The wind swept off Casco Bay that afternoon, carrying with it a cold drizzle that turned the Portland sidewalks slick and gray. Julia pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she hurried from the salon. Her freshly trimmed hair plastered damp against her cheeks, despite the umbrella she clutched. Mark had taken the car to work, so she was left to walk the mile from the bus stop back to their neighborhood. She didn't mind the exercise most days, but the sky felt heavy, and all she wanted was to get home to her boys. As she turned the corner near an abandoned house, an old clapboard place with peeling paint and sagging gutters that had sat empty for years, something caught her attention. A faint rustle, almost swallowed by the rain. She slowed, squinting through the drizzle toward a thicket of overgrown bushes by the side fence. At first she thought it might be a stray cat or raccoon, but then she heard it, the thin, uneven whimper of a child. Her heart lurched. "Hello." Julia called softly, stepping closer, rain splattering across her boots. A small figure, shifted beneath the dripping branches. When Julia knelt, her breath caught. It was Liam, the little boy from across the street. His jeans clung to his legs, soaked through. His socks were muddy, no shoes in sight. A threadbare sweater clung to his tiny frame, and in his arms he gripped a stuffed gray rabbit, its fur matted from the rain. His lips trembled as he looked up at her, wide-eyed and pale. "Liam," Julia whispered, shocked. "Honey, what are you doing out here?" He hugged the rabbit tighter, shoulders shaking. His voice came out as little more than a whisper. "Daddy's mad. Mommy's mad." The words were broken, but Julia understood enough. Her throat tightened. She reached out a hand, careful not to startle him. "It's okay. You don't have to stay out here in the cold. Come with me, sweetheart. Let's get you warm." For a moment, Liam hesitated. His small eyes darted between her hand and the wet ground, as if weighing whether he could trust her. Then, with a shiver that looked far too big for his tiny frame, he crept out from beneath the branches and let her guide him by the hand. By the time they reached the Dawsons' front door, Julia was drenched. She ushered Liam inside quickly, the warmth of the house wrapping around them. The smell of cedar and the faint lavender scent from the diffuser made the contrast almost dizzying. She hurried him to the laundry room, peeling off his soaked sweater and jeans with gentle hands. "Don't worry, I'll find something dry." She rifled through the closet until she pulled out a set of pajamas. Bright dinosaur prints, a gift someone had brought for Aiden and Cole that was still too big for them. She slipped the fabric over Liam's chilled skin, the sleeves hanging long past his wrists. "There," she said softly, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "Much better." In the kitchen, she warmed milk and stirred cocoa powder into it, the rich scent filling the air. She handed the steaming mug to Liam, who cradled it carefully in both hands. He sipped, closing his eyes as though the warmth traveled straight to his soul. The nanny, who had been minding Aiden and Cole, emerged from the nursery with a puzzled look. "Mrs. Dawson, who is this?" Julia's heart skipped. She hadn't thought this far ahead. "He's, a neighbor. Just here to play with the boys for a little while," she said quickly, forcing a smile. The nanny raised her eyebrows but didn't press, gathering her bag when Julia told her she could head home early. Once the door shut, silence fell. Liam sat at the kitchen table, sipping cocoa, his rabbit drying on a towel nearby. Julia leaned against the counter, staring at him. Something deep inside her twisted. An ache, a fierce urge to protect. The sound of the front door opening made her jump. Mark stepped in, shaking rain from his jacket, briefcase in hand. He froze when his eyes landed on the boy at the table. "Julia," he said slowly, setting the case down. "Why is Liam here?" She swallowed hard. "I found him outside, in the rain. He was freezing, Mark. I couldn't just leave him there." Mark rubbed a hand over his face. "Honey, you can't just bring him into our house like this. He has parents. They don't take care of him," Julia snapped, her voice breaking with sudden tears. He was shivering, Mark. Alone, soaked through. What kind of parents let that happen? Mark crossed the room, lowering his voice. "I know it's awful, but he isn't ours. If we get involved without thinking, it could cause trouble. We have to return him." "No," Julia's response was immediate, desperate. She clutched the back of a chair as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I can't send him back there. You didn't see him. How scared he was. How cold. Please don't make me." Mark exhaled, frustration and worry etched across his face. He knelt beside her, taking her hands. "Julia, listen. We have to be smart. He's not our child. If we want to help, there are ways. We can talk to someone, maybe report it. But sneaking him in here? That isn't the answer." She shook her head, sobbing openly now. "I know what it's like to be forgotten, to be the one nobody looks out for. I won't do that to him." The air between them thickened with tension, the quiet sound of Liam sipping cocoa the only thing breaking the silence. Julia's heart hammered in her chest, torn between the fear of overstepping and the certainty that she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. And Mark, torn between reason and compassion, could only look at his wife, his trembling, tear-streaked wife, and realize that this battle was only beginning. The weeks that followed were uneasy. Julia couldn't shake the image of Liam crouched in the rain, clutching his stuffed rabbit as though it were his only anchor in the world. Even after Mark had gently but firmly walked him back to his parents that night, the boy's face lingered in her mind. She found herself glancing across the street more often than before, heart tightening each time she saw him wandering the yard alone or following behind his parents like a shadow. Mark tried to reassure her. "We did what we could," he told her one evening as they washed bottles together at the kitchen sink. "If there's real neglect, the system will step in." But Julia's chest ached at the thought. She knew what the system often meant: strangers, uncertainty, children shuffled from one place to another. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Saturday, early spring, the air still sharp with lingering cold. Julia had just tucked Aiden and Cole into their cribs when her phone buzzed with a message from the neighbor 2 houses down. "Did you hear?" The text read, "There's been an accident." Her stomach sank. She typed back quickly what happened. The reply came within minutes. The couple across the street. "Car crash." Neither of them made it. Julia stood frozen in the nursery doorway, the glow from the baby monitor painting her in pale light. The sound of her son's breathing softly should have been comforting, but all she could hear was the echo of those words. Neither of them made it. By the next morning, the neighborhood was alive with whispers. News traveled fast in suburban Portland. Liam's parents had been driving home late, both of them drunk, when their car swerved off the road and struck a tree. The details blurred with each retelling, but the ending was always the same. They were gone, leaving behind a little boy with no one to claim him. Julia's heart pounded as she stood at the kitchen window, staring at the darkened house across the street. She could almost see Liam's small silhouette against the glass, though she knew it was only her mind painting him there. At the grocery store that week, she overheard more pieces of the story. One of the clerks leaned across the counter, lowering her voice. The relatives came in. "They don't want to deal with the boy. Just asked about what'll happen to the house." Another shopper chimed in, shaking her head. "He'll probably end up in foster care. That's what they said." Julia's hands trembled as she placed milk on the conveyor belt. Foster care. The words felt like ice in her veins. She imagined Liam's wide eyes staring up at strangers, being handed from one temporary home to another, clutching his rabbit as his only constant. She pictured him forgotten in the shuffle, lost the way she had once felt lost in her own childhood home, invisible among too many siblings. That night, she sat on the living room floor with Aiden and Cole crawling around her. Their tiny hands tugged at her sweater, their laughter bubbling up like music. But Julia's gaze drifted toward the window again. She pictured her sons in Liam's place, alone, unwanted, dependent on a system that couldn't possibly love them the way a parent should. The thought made her chest seize with panic. Tears blurred her vision. She pulled Aiden close, then Cole, hugging them so tightly they squirmed in protest. "I'll never let that happen to you," she whispered fiercely. But as soon as the words left her lips, her mind circled back to Liam, who was whispering the same promise to him. Mark found her later, rocking both babies in her arms, though they were long past due for sleep. "Julia," he said softly, setting down his work bag. "What's going on?" Her voice cracked as she answered. "He's going into foster care, Mark. They don't want him. They only care about the house, the money. What's going to happen to him?" Mark exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but you can't carry this like it's ours to fix." But Julia shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "You don't get it. I can't just stand by and watch. Not him. Not after everything I've seen. I won't let him be tossed around like he doesn't matter." The conviction in her voice startled even herself. For weeks, she had been weighed down by fear, but now a different kind of fire lit inside her. The thought of Liam swallowed by the foster system felt unbearable, like a wound she couldn't let form. That night, as the rain tapped gently against the windows, Julia lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of being the eldest daughter pressed into service as a second mother, of how it felt to be invisible. She thought of Liam's trembling voice in the rain. Daddy's mad. Mommy's mad. Her decision crystallized with terrifying clarity. She could not let him disappear into the system, not while she had a voice, not while she had arms strong enough to hold him and a home with room to spare. She turned toward Mark, sleeping soundly beside her, and whispered into the dark, "I can't let him go." Julia waited until after dinner to bring it up. The boys were asleep in their cribs upstairs, and the house had finally settled into its nighttime rhythm. Mark was at the kitchen table, flipping through architectural sketches with a pencil balanced between his fingers. The lamplight cast soft shadows across his face. He looked content, grounded, exactly the way she needed him to be. But her chest ached with the words pressing against her ribs. She couldn't keep them in any longer. "Mark," she began, her voice unsteady, "I want us to adopt Liam." The pencil dropped from his fingers, rolling across the table. He blinked at her as though she'd spoken in another language. "Julia, do you know what you're saying?" "Yes." Her hands trembled, but her tone was firm. "His parents are gone. The relatives don't want him. He'll go into foster care, and you know what that means. I can't let it happen. I won't." Mark leaned back, exhaling heavily. "Julia, this isn't just about wanting to help. Adoption isn't simple. There are responsibilities, expenses, lawyers, home studies, court hearings. It's months of paperwork, background checks, financial reviews. It's not just opening our door and saying he can stay." "I know." Julia shot back, tears pricking her eyes. "I've looked into it. I've read everything I can. And I don't care how hard it is. He needs us." Mark rubbed his forehead, his voice tight. "And what about Aiden and Cole? They're still babies. We barely sleep as it is. Adding another child, it's not fair to them. Or to us." Her voice broke as she leaned forward. "It isn't fair to Liam either. He didn't ask for this. He's 3 years old, Mark. If we don't step in, he's going to be bounced around from one stranger to another, growing up thinking no one wanted him. I know what that feels like." Mark's expression softened, but the conflict in his eyes was clear. He thought of their late-night walks with Liam tagging along awkwardly, of the boy's tentative smile when Julia gave him cocoa, of the way he lingered near their fence as if he wanted to belong. Against his better judgment, Mark realized he already felt protective of him too. He let out a long breath. "I don't want him to suffer either. But this is big, Julia. It changes everything." "Everything is already changing," she whispered, "and maybe that's okay." They sat in silence, the ticking of the kitchen clock filling the space between them. Finally, Mark reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "If we do this, we do it right. No shortcuts. We go through the court, CPS, the entire process." "Agreed." Julia's relief came in a rush, tears sliding down her cheeks as she nodded. "Agreed." The following weeks were a blur of phone calls and appointments. They met with a caseworker from the Maine Department of Health and Human Services, who explained the foster system and what it would take to pursue adoption. They filled out forms, submitted to background checks, and opened their home to inspection. Julia scrubbed every corner of the house until it gleamed, anxious for every visit. Mark rearranged his schedule, balancing deadlines at work with court dates and agency meetings. At one point, they met with Liam's extended relatives, an aunt and uncle who had driven up from Massachusetts. The conversation was brief and painfully matter-of-fact. "We can't take him," the aunt said flatly, her eyes darting anywhere but Julia's. "We don't have the time, the space, or the money. Honestly, it's better if he goes to a family who actually wants him." Julia's heart twisted at the words. but Mark squeezed her hand under the table. He could see the fire in her eyes and knew she would never back down. Months passed. Paperwork shuffled, hearings scheduled and postponed, until at last they stood before a judge in a small courtroom in Portland. Julia held Liam's tiny hand in hers, her heart hammering. The judge looked over the documents, then up at them with a measured expression. "Mr. and Mrs. Dawson," he said, "are you prepared to assume full responsibility for this child, financially, emotionally, and legally, as though he were born to you?" Julia's throat tightened. "Yes," she whispered. Mark nodded firmly. "Yes, we are." The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Then, by the authority of the state of Maine, the petition for adoption is granted." Julia felt her knees go weak, tears welling as she bent to hug Liam. He looked at her uncertainly, then at Mark, before leaning into Julia's embrace. That evening, the Dawsons returned home as a family of 5. The air in the house felt different, brighter, fuller, as though the walls themselves understood something had changed. Julia and Mark led Liam down the hallway to a small bedroom they had painted pale blue, with a quilt folded neatly on the bed and shelves stocked with toys and books. "This is your room now," Julia said softly. Liam's eyes widened to small fingers brushing the quilt as though testing if it was real. Then he looked up at them, his voice shy but clear. Can I say hi to my brothers?" Julia's tears spilled over as she nodded. "Of course you can." Together, they walked into the nursery where Aiden and Cole were stirring from their naps. Liam stepped closer, peering into the cribs. "Hi," he whispered, his smile tentative but hopeful. And in that moment, as Mark slipped an arm around Julia's shoulders, it was clear. Liam wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was theirs. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the heater and the faint rustle of wind off the bay. Julia padded softly into the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. She paused in the doorway, watching Mark at the table. He was bent over a sheet of graph paper, pencil in hand, sketching something with that familiar intensity that meant he was already lost in a new design. She hesitated, her heart beating faster than it should. For days, she had carried a secret, one that felt too fragile to put into words. But tonight, as the moonlight spilled across the floor, she knew she couldn't hold it in any longer. "Mark," she said quietly. He looked up, smiling absently. "Hey, couldn't sleep?" "Not really." She stepped closer, placing her mug on the table. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. "I need to tell you something, and you have to promise not to laugh." His brows rose. "Julia, I would never laugh at you." She drew in a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." For a second, the pencil stilled in his hand. His eyes widened, searching her face for any trace of a joke. "Pregnant? But Dr. Grant said, I know." Her voice trembled, but a smile broke through her nerves. She said the chances were almost 0. "But I took the test 3 times. I went back for blood work this week. It's real, Mark. I'm pregnant." He pushed back his chair, so quickly it scraped against the floor. "Oh my God!" In 2 strides, he was at her side, pulling her into his arms. His breath caught as he held her, one hand tangled in her hair, the other pressed against her back as though to keep her from vanishing. "Julia, this is the happiest moment of my life." Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered against his chest. "Are you sure? I know it's a lot. 3 little ones already. Don't." He tilted her chin up so she had to meet his gaze. His eyes shone with a mixture of awe and certainty. "This isn't a burden. It's a miracle. We thought it would never happen again, and yet here we are. Julia, we're being given something we didn't even dare to hope for." She laughed softly, tears spilling over. "I was so scared to tell you." He kissed her forehead. "Scared? I feel like the luckiest man alive. Look at us. Aiden, Cole, Liam, and now another little one. Our family is fuller than I ever dreamed." In the days that followed, Their home seemed infused with new energy. Julia caught herself humming while she folded laundry, her hands unconsciously drifting to her stomach. Mark, true to form, immediately began planning. One Saturday morning, he spread out blueprints on the dining table. "I'm thinking we expand the backyard," he said, eyes bright. "We'll build a swing set here, maybe add a sandbox next to it. And you've always wanted flower beds along the fence. We'll do that too. It'll be a space for all of them to grow up together." Julia leaned over his shoulder, studying the lines he'd drawn. "You really think we can manage it all?" He slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "We've managed everything else. Why not this?" The twins toddled through the room just then, Aiden dragging a toy truck, Cole clutching a worn blanket. Liam trailed behind, carrying his stuffed rabbit. They crowded around the table, peering at the drawings with wide eyes. "What's that?" Liam asked, pointing to the sketched swing set. "That," Mark said with a grin, "is where you're going to fly higher than the trees." The boy's face lit up, his smile bright and unguarded. Julia felt her throat tighten at the sight. It was moments like this, small, ordinary flashes of joy, that reassured her they were doing the right thing. Spring crept slowly over Portland. The snow melted into soft earth, and the Dawsons' backyard became a canvas for transformation. Mark dug into the soil, setting posts for the swing set while Liam helped carry tools. Julia knelt by the fence, pressing seeds into neat rows, her hands dirty and her heart full. Aiden and Cole squealed in their playpen nearby, watching the flurry of activity. By the time the sun dipped low, the yard bore the beginnings of their dream. Wooden beams rising for the swing set, a box framed for the sandbox. Fresh soil dark against the budding flower beds. Julia stood with her hand on her stomach, the faint swell beneath her sweater a reminder of the new life growing inside. Mark joined her, wiping sweat from his brow, his smile tired but content. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Can you picture it? The kids running here, flowers blooming, laughter everywhere." She leaned into him, her eyes glistening. "I can. For the first time in a long time, I really can." And as the evening light bathed their unfinished garden, Julia felt a sense of hope settle deep in her bones. For years, she had feared that too many children would break her, that her past would repeat itself. But standing there with Mark, surrounded by the children they already loved and the promise of one more, she realized something she had never allowed herself to believe. Love had no limits. 3 years passed, and the Dawson home blossomed in ways Julia never could have imagined. The backyard that Mark had once sketched on paper was now alive with color and sound. The swing set stood sturdy against the sky. The sandbox was filled with buckets and shovels, and flower beds lined the fence with bursts of tulips and daisies. The house itself hummed with the rhythm of family life, noisy, messy, but undeniably full. On a golden summer afternoon, the Dawsons gathered to celebrate Sophie's 3rd birthday. She had been born on a rainy night in June, a small miracle Julia never thought possible. And now here she was, bright-eyed, with dark curls bouncing as she toddled across the lawn. A checkered picnic blanket spread across the grass, topped with plates of sandwiches, bowls of fruit, and a pink frosted cake waiting to be cut. Aiden and Cole, now rambunctious 6-year-olds, darted back and forth across the yard in a game of tag. Their laughter rang out like bells, their legs carrying them faster than Julia could track. They were inseparable, mirrors of each other in spirit, if not always in looks. One would stumble, and the other would instantly reach to pull him back up. Near the picnic blanket, Liam sat with Sophie, carefully holding a small comb in his hand. At 6 years old, he had been a shy, uncertain boy, but at 9 he carried himself with quiet confidence. He leaned close to his little sister, tongue pressed in concentration as he tried to braid her short curls into something resembling pigtails. "Hold still, Sophie," he said gently, his voice patient. Sophie giggled, squirming under his hands. "It tickles." Julia watched from a few feet away, her chest swelling with emotion. The sight was so simple, yet it struck her deeply, her children together, caring for one another in ways she once feared would never be possible. Mark settled beside her on the blanket, handing her a glass of lemonade. "What are you staring at so hard?" he asked, though his smile said he already knew. She nodded toward the children. "Look at them. Aiden and Cole running wild. Liam fussing over Sophie like she's made of glass. Can you believe this is our life?" Mark followed her gaze, his expression softening. "I can, because we fought for it, and because you never gave up." Julia swallowed hard, memories tugging at her. There was a time when she had begged fate for only one child. One, because she thought that was all she could manage without losing herself. One, because the weight of her childhood still pressed heavy on her shoulders. And yet here she was, mother to four, two born of her body, one chosen by her heart, and one she had never expected but cherished with every breath. She felt tears sting her eyes as Liam looked up and caught her watching. "She's my little sister," he said proudly, as if it were the most important truth in the world. "And she's already beautiful." Julia pressed a hand over her mouth, her heart aching with tenderness. Sophie beamed at his words, reaching to hug him with sticky frosting-covered fingers. Liam laughed and let her, unfazed by the mess. Aiden and Cole barreled toward the blanket, demanding cake, their cheeks flushed and hair damp with sweat. Mark corralled them with mock sternness, promising cake only after everyone sang. Soon, voices rose together, off-key but joyous, as Sophie clapped her hands and blew out the candles with one determined puff. As Julia watched the smoke curl upward, she felt the years fold in on themselves. She remembered the sterile clinic where she had first learned she carried twins, the terror that had gripped her chest. She remembered Liam shivering in the rain, his small voice trembling with fear. She remembered the gavel striking in the courtroom, the moment he became theirs. And she remembered the disbelief in Mark's eyes when she told him she was pregnant again, the miracle of Sophie's arrival. Every moment had led here, to this picnic, this messy backyard filled with laughter and love. Mark reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "You used to be afraid there wouldn't be enough of you to go around," he murmured. She nodded, her throat tight. "I did. And now." She squeezed his hand, her eyes fixed on the children tumbling together in the grass. "Now I know love doesn't divide. It multiplies. My heart, it's bigger than I ever thought it could be." Mark kissed her temple, his smile content. "That's all I ever wanted for you, to see that." The evening stretched golden and warm, the air filled with the scent of cake and flowers, the sound of children's laughter rising above the hum of cicadas. Julia leaned against Mark's shoulder, her gaze lingering on her family. For the first time in her life, she felt completely unburdened by the past. The cycle she had feared would consume her had been broken. In its place stood something new, a family stitched together by both fate and choice, held steady by love. The sun filtered through the maples at the edge of the Dawsons' yard, scattering golden patches of light across the grass. It was late afternoon, the kind of summer day that seemed to stretch lazily toward evening. The family picnic had become a ritual now. Sandwiches packed in a basket, lemonade poured into mason jars, and a blanket spread wide beneath the sky. Today, though, carried a quiet significance. Sophie, now toddling confidently at 3, had decided she was ready to take her first longer steps on the uneven lawn. Her curls bounced as she wobbled forward, arms stretched wide for balance. Julia sat on the blanket, breath caught in her throat, her hands hovering as if ready to catch her youngest at any second. Just a few feet away, Liam walked beside Sophie, his small hand steady near her shoulder, but not holding on. He had grown into his role as big brother with a kind of tenderness that sometimes made Julia's chest ache. "You got it, Sophie," he encouraged, his voice calm and sure. "Keep going. I'm right here." Behind them, Aiden and Cole shouted cheers as though their sister were running a marathon. Go, Sophie! You can do it! Don't fall! Their laughter rang across the yard, full of pride in their little sister's determination. Sophie stumbled once, her tiny shoe catching on the grass, but Liam's hand was there in an instant, steadying her before she could fall. She looked up at him, her face breaking into a grin, and pressed forward again until she collapsed into Julia's waiting arms. The yard erupted in applause, led by Mark's deep, joyful laugh. He clapped Aiden and Cole on the shoulders as if they had been her personal trainers. Your sister's already a champion, he said proudly. Julia hugged Sophie tight, her heart thudding with both relief and wonder. When she looked up, her gaze swept over all 4 children gathered around her.